vamos conversar com o professor Edwin Gale, que é um médico britânico, professor emérito da Universidade de Bristol e também editor da revista de Diabetologia. Veio aqui ao Brasil a convite da Sociedade Brasileira de Endocrinologia para falar sobre a influência da indústria farmacêutica sobre a produção de conhecimento médico, especialmente na área de diabetes. Esse é o assunto que nós conversamos com o professor Gale agora. Dr. Gale, when was the first time that this subject, the influence that pharma has on doctors, caught your attention enough to make you start writing about it?
I guess it happened about 10 years ago. Before that time I had frequently consulted for the pharmaceutical industry, but I was asked to do some in-depth preparation for a big public lecture, which made me go behind the facade to look at what was really going on, particularly to go onto the internet, to look at some of the studies that hadn't been published, to look at the difference between the presentation of the drug and some of the reality. And from that point on I realized that actually one had to represent the doctors, the public interest, not the companies.
How did it change you?
I became a lot poorer.
I see.
It changed me in other ways. It made me some enemies. In particular, some of the colleagues who were still working with the pharmaceutical industry, because I was not perfect, I have done this myself in the past, but some of the colleagues who continued to work with industry became quietly very angry with me. You know, sometimes I was attacked for that. But on the whole, the thing I discovered was the incredible support that exists. People want to hear the truth. And the weapon I've discovered that is really important is the combination of truth and humor. Because truth and humor is very hard for anyone to defend themselves against.
Of course. Could you say that now you do not have or do not suffer any influence from Big Pharma?
We live in a world where we all influence each other, and although I am critical of Big Pharma, I am not an enemy of Big Pharma. And there's an important difference in that, I think. As I have said on many occasions, the medical profession gets the pharmaceutical industry it deserves. If the medical profession behaved differently, Big Pharma would behave differently, because we are the consumer. We're the people who write the prescriptions from which they make their profits. If we had higher standards, Pharma would have higher standards. So I don't blame the industry. I blame the profession for the way it interacts with the industry. If we clean up our act, if we accept that some of the things we do actually are not acceptable, I think it is shaming to the profession that senior, important, powerful people can take large sums of money and then turn round and say we can represent the public interest on this. It can't be done, and it is wrong, and it must not be allowed to continue.
What is the average reaction that you get from your colleagues in your lectures?
Well, the people who come to my lectures are the people who tend to agree with what I say. So that has to be said. There is enormous support out there. I think particularly the average doctor, the young doctors in particular, and the medical students, they're the people I want to talk to, because they're the future. And among those groups, I think they look at the picture of their seniors and they're shocked. They're shocked to see what is going on. We've got to speak to those people, because they're our future.
But how can a doctor be aware of all the bias in a scientific research published in a medical magazine?
Well, I was trying to explain that in my lecture, because one of the problems we have in medicine is that we train our medical students to think the same way, to believe truths, to understand certain facts. This is what you need to tell your examiners to pass the exam, and then you'll get the top mark because you give all the answers that your examiners are expecting you to say. And the student who goes in and is critical in the examination will probably have a very hard time. So part of our training is to be very conventional and to think the same way. What we have to do, I think, is right from the beginning to help people to understand that knowledge is continuously changing. For example, I write the diabetes chapter for one of the big textbooks of medicine, and I've done it through 7 editions. And every time I write it, the truth changes. So what the medical students will, and what I have to write is not what I believe to be true, but what I believe the examiners of the medical students will believe to be true, because that is accepted or received knowledge. So I have to write something that is not quite the truth, but is just what people will accept and understand as the truth. And every edition that changes slightly. So we have to teach our medical students to exist in a world where information is changing all the time. And to understand that if you're looking at changing information, then you have to look critically at information, and you have to realize that every study has a problem and has its limitations. And the way around that, I think, is simply not to allow the massive propaganda exercise that Big Pharma runs, because they do. We have to mount our own counter-propaganda enterprise. If they teach us one thing, we have to teach the same thing better in another way.
Isn't it curious that when you ask a doctor if he has suffered influence from the pharmaceutical industry, he often says no.
He always says no.
He always says no. But when you ask a different question, do you think that your colleagues have suffered industry from pharmaceutical industry? It changes. And they say, yeah, I think they did so.
That's right, because we're all egotists, aren't we? We all think we're better than other people.
Even your colleagues.
Exactly, of course. Especially your colleagues.
But in your lecture, you talked about invented diseases, and that's something that I've always thought that marketing was something that was the area that invented disease. But then guidelines are now inventing diseases.
Yes, extending
diseases.
Yes.
And guidelines are made by doctors.
Yeah.
So kind of puts us in a
well,
our backs against the wall. And
it's true, but I think the combination of humor and truth is the way forward. I've often said that a specialist is someone who defines a problem in such a way that he, the specialist, is the solution. And this is what guideline committees do. They extend the problem. They're saying diabetes is more common than you think. You know, this problem is more common than you think. There has to be a solution. Who knows about the solution? Well, me. And if you're a pharmaceutical company, then you have the medication that provides the solution to that. And it's a simple question of what is health and what is disease. What do we define as being a healthy, normal human being? What do we define as a patient? The pharmaceutical companies, as I said in my lecture, would like a world in which everyone was a patient. And the professional organizations would not admit it, but they would benefit from a situation in which everyone was a patient. But we aren't patients. That's what we've got to understand, and the doctors have got to be the first to say, this is the point at which we stop. And if I don't know, then I'm not going to give a treatment. And I'm not going to make a statement to say that I don't know. And that's very difficult because, as I said, guideline committees constantly do that.
You also said that guidelines are not mandatory, and that's a common mistake.
Yeah, exactly. A guideline is advice. It's advice, and to say that there can be evidence-based guidelines is a contradiction in terms. If you have evidence, you don't need a guideline, do you? You know, I don't need a guideline to say that if I take your pen and drop it, it will fall to the floor, because it will.
That's gravity.
Yeah, it's gravity. So guidelines always exist in the face of uncertainty, and people have trouble coping with uncertainty. You know, people try to fill uncertainty with words.
And you said in your lecture that no society is going to say, I don't know, and that's the most difficult thing.
Exactly.
That a doctor says another society, a specialty society would say. And why is that?
It's human. If you're a specialist and you're supposed to know about something, I come to Brazil and give a talk and someone asks me a question about diabetes, it's hard to say I don't know. In many ways, medicine is a way of expressing ignorance in a very learned way.
So, agradecemos então a presença do Dr. Edwin Gale, professor Edwin Gale, e o Atividade UNISIMERS desta semana fica por aqui. Até a próxima.